He forgot his dad was allergic to almonds, and his father's lips swelled up like balloons. Robbie's dad had to go to the emergency room to get a shot, which made it hard for Robbie to enjoy his ice cream. When Robbie got home, he noticed a small chocolate stain on his crisp white shirt. And the whole thing started up again. A mummy. A long time ago in ancient Egypt, there lived a pharaoh named Mech. And when Mech died, the royal priests and priestesses wrapped his body to prepare it for the afterlife. But a few thousand years later, some archaeologists from another country discovered Mech's pyramid and took his sarcophagus with them. When Mech woke up, he was disappointed to find out he was in a museum, and not in the afterlife like he'd expected. On top of that, they didn't even put his sarcophagus in a nice spot. They stuck him right next to the family restroom. So Mech was angry, and he used his mummy powers to make a big mess of things in the museum. But even after Mech destroyed the museum, he wasn't satisfied. So he went outside, and that's where he really did some damage. By tossing buses and cabs in the air, starting fires, and creating mayhem. That night, Mech was all over the news for wrecking the city. Mummy's revenge. Mech was just getting started, though. He went from country to country, destroying everything in his path. And wherever he went, he made headlines. Mummy détruit la vie. But after a while, Mech ran out of things to destroy, and people started losing interest anyway. City news. Ribbon cutting at new dog park. Mummy destroys piñata at child's birthday party. Eventually, Mech settled down a little and tried to get used to living in the modern world. And even though he would have rather been in the afterlife, he had to admit that television was a pretty great invention. One night, Mech was watching the news, and there was a story about how some archaeologists made a new discovery in Egypt. They found the tomb of Kaaba, a pharaoh who lived a few thousand years ago. New Egyptian tomb unearthed. Well, at first, Mech started getting angry, because this brought back memories of what happened to him. But after a few minutes of deep breathing, he was able to calm down. People were excited about this new discovery, because Kaaba's tomb was really glitzy and full of treasures. But everyone was nervous when they opened Kaaba's sarcophagus, because no one wanted a repeat of the Mech situation. Things were different this time around, though. First of all, Kaaba was much better preserved than Mech. And Mech was kind of annoyed when the people on the news kept pointing that out. Mech. Ew. Kaaba. Handsome. When Kaaba stepped out of his tomb, he didn't just start randomly destroying things. In fact, he seemed curious about the modern world and everything in it. Water fountains, soda machines, segways. Kaaba started appearing on morning talk shows, and before long he was everyone's favorite mummy. And Mech never would have admitted he was jealous, but he was. In fact, Kaaba was so popular that people started making all sorts of mummy merchandise and used his image without asking permission. So, Kaaba hired a slick lawyer, and before long all that stuff was shut down. But then, Kaaba's lawyer took it a step further. His lawyer trademarked the mummy, which made it so that Kaaba was the only one who could use the name. And then she made a big announcement about it in front of the TV cameras. Well, this really ticked off Mech, who didn't think it was right that Kaaba could do that. Plus, Mech was annoyed that he didn't think of it first. After a while, Kaaba had his own fashion line and kids' cereal, and even a major motion picture in the works. And everywhere Mech went, there was Kaaba's face. The Mummy the Musical. The Mummy Jeans. The Mummy Gift Shop. Mech thought it was time for him to cash in on this mummy craze too. So he started calling himself the Original Mummy, and he put a few ads out there. The Original Mummy, available for birthday parties, corporate events, bar bat mitzvahs. Ask for Mech. But a few weeks later, Mech got a letter from Kaaba's lawyer threatening to sue him for everything he owned unless he took down the ads. But this just made Mech mad. Maybe not as mad as when he used to go around destroying cities with his mummy powers, but still pretty mad. So Mech hired a lawyer of his own, and sued Kaba to try and stop him from calling himself the Mummy, since Mech was famous first. And it was a huge trial, and everyone watched it on TV. Mummies square off in court. Well, Mech didn't have a lot of money, so his lawyer wasn't as slick as Kaba's. And when the trial ended, the judge ruled that Kaba was the winner. Mech had to agree that he'd never use the name the original Mummy, or the classic Mummy, or anything like that. In fact, all he was allowed to do was call himself a Mummy, in lowercase letters. For a while, Mech tried to make some money by calling himself a mummy, but you really can't make any money with a name like that. Mech started working at an amusement park for Fright Nights in October. But it wasn't that much fun, because it was a lot harder to scare people these days. Groan! Mech still wasn't giving up, though. He started calling himself the Dead Pharaoh to get around the court agreement, but it turns out there was already a professional wrestler with that name, and Mech just ended up back in court. Things were great for Kaba for a few years, but after a while the whole mummy act got stale, and people stopped going to his movies. Eventually he got into comedy, but he made a few stinkers, and that was the end of his film career. Not your daddy's mummy. Then someone claimed they found a big toe in a box of mummy flakes, and Kaba got sued for $1 million. Big toe found in cereal. And even though it turned out the person who sued him made the whole thing up, nobody would buy any food products with the word mummy on them after that. Soon Kaba's money started to dry up, and he couldn't afford the fancy lifestyle he was used to. After a while, he had to sell his private jet and his 3 mansions at a discount. Things got even worse when his wife left him and took half his money. Kaba finally hit rock bottom when he had to sell his own sarcophagus. But things started to turn around for Kaba when he ran into his old arch-enemy Mech, who was working as a food bagger at the grocery store. The 2 mummies got to talking, and it turned out they had a lot more in common than they thought. Kaba and Mech became friends, and after a while, Kaba moved into Mech's apartment. And even though they didn't always get along as roommates, the one thing they agreed on was that television really was a pretty great invention. The Science Project. There was once a boy named Victor, and Victor was not a happy child. This was a long time ago, before video games and TV and all that, so the only thing that Victor had to entertain himself with were books. And since his parents were both doctors, the only kinds of books they kept in the house were ones about science and medicine and stuff like that. The other thing that made Victor sad was that his parents wouldn't let him have a pet. They told Victor he wasn't responsible enough to take care of an animal, and that they'd end up doing all the work. And even when Victor promised he'd feed his pet and take it outside 3 times a day, the answer was always no. The only thing that really made Victor happy was school. He was a smart kid from reading his parents' books, and his science teacher said if he studied hard, he'd be famous for his work one day. So when it was time for the middle school science fair, Victor was really excited. He worked for a whole month on his particle physics dark matter project, and he hoped it was good enough to win first place. But Lizzie Leggett won with a How Do Volcanoes Work project that Victor was sure her parents had helped her with. So Lizzie walked away with a first-place ribbon, and all Victor got was a lousy honorable mention certificate. From that moment on, all Victor could think about was next year's science fair. He read his parents' books from front to back, trying to come up with an idea for a new project, but he couldn't think of anything that would really knock people's socks off. One day, when Victor was looking out his back window at the cemetery behind his house, he got an idea. To be honest, it was kind of a twisted idea, but Victor knew if he could pull it off, his project would win first place in the science fair for sure. Victor did experiments in his attic every night to get ready for the science fair, His parents thought he was spending too much time by himself and wondered if maybe they should have let him have a pet after all. One year later, it was finally time for the big science fair, and Victor brought his "Can Electricity Bring the Dead to Life" project with him to school. And if you want to know where Victor got the materials for his science project, let's just say sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. Even though Victor had been working on his project for a whole year, he didn't know if it was going to actually work. But he knew if he didn't, he'd lose to Lizzie Leggett for the second year in a row. So when the judges gathered around his project, Victor crossed his fingers and threw the switch. Zup! It's alive! All of Victor's hard work paid off when his creation came to life. Groan! And this time, Victor got the first place ribbon, and Lizzie was the one who had to settle for honorable mention. On the walk home, Victor was feeling pretty good about himself. But he kind of wished he'd thought about what was going to happen after the science fair was over, because now he didn't know what he was supposed to do with his project. Victor thought maybe he could ditch his creation at the cemetery, but his science project wouldn't take the hint. Victor picked a stick off the ground and chucked it over the cemetery gate, but his creation thought it was a game and brought the stick right back. Then Victor started having fun with his science project, and the two of them played for hours outside. And Victor found out the thing his creation liked the most was to have his belly rubbed. "Who's a good boy?" "You're a good boy." "Oh, yes, you are." Victor told his parents about his first place ribbon at the science fair, and they were very proud of their son. And even though they were a little concerned about where Victor got the materials for his project, they knew that sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. Victor asked if he could keep his science project as a pet, and after he promised to feed it and take it out 3 times a day, they finally gave in and said yes. From that day on, Victor and his new pet were the best of friends, and they never spent a day apart. Victor became famous just like his science teacher predicted, and he was always in the paper for one thing or another. "Victor Frankenstein makes nanotech breakthrough." Each year, Victor got a little older, but his pet didn't age. And when Victor finally died, his loyal sidekick was right there by his side. Over the years, people forgot all about Victor Frankenstein, but his pet became kind of famous. People called him Frankenstein's pet, or Frankenstein's monster. But after a while, they just called him Frankenstein. And he was okay with that, but it kind of made him miss his old friend. "What's shakin', Frankie?" Frankenstein didn't know what to do with all his free time now that Victor was gone, but he knew you couldn't really do anything without an education. So he went to school, starting with the 1st grade. And even though he was bigger than the other kids, they treated him like he was one of them. Frankenstein was a quick learner, and he actually skipped a few grades. In middle school, he entered the science fair and took 1st place just like his friend Victor. And if you're wondering where he got the materials for his project, let's just say that sometimes, when a creation has the body of a dog and a head that resembles Victor Frankenstein, it's better not to ask too many questions. Orf! The medicine cabinet. Ryan was a curious boy, and he loved